People with European descent, it is known and quite likely that you will develop Good morning, friends. In this video, we're going to talk about what vitamin D levels are like among white people or people of European descent. But before we do, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, like the video and comment on the video to help the channel's growth. Now let's get started. First, I want to tell you what we're going to discuss here. First, we're going to want to know what we want to measure to find out vitamin D levels in people. Second, we're going to talk about, we're going to briefly talk about how to measure it, but then we're going to get into the different vitamin D levels of people of European descent around the world, in North America, in the US, and in Canada, as well as in Europe. And we're going to look at the differential levels of vitamin D across Europeans. And then we're going to talk about specific segments of the population that are particularly at risk. Also, before we get started, I just wanted to apologize to you guys because not every video in this series can be equally interesting. In order for us to be able to really develop some knowledge about the subject, especially knowledge that isn't commonly held, we need to establish some facts. So in this video, it's going to be a little bit more dry, but it's useful and hopefully it won't be too difficult to get through. Now let's get started. First, we have to talk about what we measure when we're speaking of vitamin D levels in people. There are a few vitamin D metabolites that could be useful. One of the things that differentiates them is their affinity for the vitamin D receptor. One of them is considered really the active form because it has the highest affinity to the vitamin D receptor. But among these metabolites, they also have different half-lives. Their differential half-lives are what guided academics and clinicians in choosing one of them to be the industry standard or the consensus biomarker that's used to measure vitamin D. Let's talk about the different half-lives of these metabolites here. The half-lives, by the way, are determined mostly by these metabolites being bound to what's called the vitamin D binding protein. The vitamin D binding protein, for example, binds about 85% of the main metabolite that's used by clinicians and academics to judge vitamin D status. That same metabolite is also bound about 15% by albumin, which binds a lot of proteins in our body. And the remaining about 0.03% is free to attach to the vitamin D receptor. Now, talking about these different metabolites, let's begin with vitamin D3. Vitamin D3 has a half-life of a day. After you take in vitamin D3, you get a metabolite from your liver called 25-OH-D3. 25-OH-D3 is the main metabolite used by clinicians and academics. It's what we're going to be talking about in this video. The reason that 25-OH-D3 is used as the major metabolite to judge vitamin D status is because it has the longest half-life. Its average half-life is around 2 weeks, although it depends on whether it's made out of D2 or D3. The D2 version is a little bit shorter of a half-life, around just over 13 days, whereas the D3 metabolite is around 15 days. Once your liver produces 25-OH-D3, your kidneys eventually convert it into what's called 1,2,5-OH2D, or D3 in this case. That metabolite has the highest affinity for the vitamin D receptor. Unfortunately, it has a half-life that's only 4 hours or so it can't give you a very good perspective of your average vitamin D over time because it has a lot of volatility with it, which is why it's mainly not used as much as the liver metabolite. Also, by the way, after that metabolite from the kidney is produced, you eventually get an inactivated form of the kidney metabolite, which is called 2,4,2,5-OH2D3. That metabolite is also a little bit useful. Let me give you an example why. The kidney metabolite, the levels of that are very much associated with hypercalcemia. That is the excess of calcium that can happen when you have what's called hypervitaminosis D, or too high of a vitamin D level. Not only that, but a ratio you can make out of the liver metabolite and the inactivated version of vitamin D produces also a very good indicator of hypercalcemia. These are both much better indicators than the liver metabolite, which is used by everyone, the 25-OH-D3. So as you can see, there is reason for disagreement among academics about which are the best metabolites to use to judge vitamin D status. But there's also another problem, which is that the binding proteins on vitamin D are considered by some academics to represent a class of vitamin D that is less informative to us. Some academics think that they want the unbound vitamin D metabolites as indicators of what's actually happening in the body actively. However, there's a reason I personally, and by the way, this is built on a hypothesis called I think it's the free hormone hypothesis. Now, this hypothesis basically asserts that hormones in general, including for example, testosterone, Bound testosterone, not free testosterone. You guys have probably heard of that before. The people that talk about that stuff are the people very interested in unbound hormones. The same discussion exists in the subject of vitamin D. I don't personally find that unbound vitamin D is likely a very good indicator by itself for a couple of reasons. One reason is that unbound vitamin D has a much shorter half-life in the body, and therefore it's representing a less of a consistent effect in the body over the long term. But also there's several other reasons, including that vitamin D binding protein is necessary for the sun's vitamin D, which we'll talk about later. The sun's vitamin D is slightly stronger than not slightly, but doubly stronger than vitamin D3 that you take. But for the sun's vitamin D to be able to be that powerful, you need vitamin D binding protein to guide it in its action. Vitamin D binding protein is important, so I like to look at both bound and unbound vitamin D. We'll talk a little bit more about these details in a future video, but I wanted you guys to understand that in this video, when we're talking about vitamin D levels, we're talking about that liver metabolite, 25-OH-D3. That's the metabolite everybody uses in the studies. There are some studies that look into other biomarkers, of course, but this is the industry standard. When you talk about vitamin D levels to somebody else, you're talking about that liver metabolite. I just wanted to make this all clear so that you guys don't get confused when somebody else uses a different metabolite. You can realize that, oh, this one's from the liver, you might be talking about one from the kidney, you might be talking about potentially just the half-life of the thing I'm taking, or you might be talking about the inactivated form. Usually these are the most important metabolites that people will talk about. Actually, two other notes before I leave the subject of the binding proteins and the metabolites. One is that the vitamin D binding protein, which has an acronym of DBP, that binding protein is actually coded by the gene GC, which I mentioned before in the last video. Second, I want to mention that bound vitamin D metabolites can still have effects, for example, in the kidney. So for example, the bound vitamin D metabolite from the liver can have effects in the kidney. It depends on whether certain tissue have megalin in them. But this is really too detailed and not really important for our discussion. I just want to be comprehensive. But how is the liver metabolite measured? The liver metabolite can be measured through quite inaccurate assays called immunoassays. The immunoassays are less sensitive and less consistent across the industry in the way that they're performed. Usually, when you get your vitamin D levels tested, unless you paid extra, you're going to get it tested with an immunoassay. And it's going to be quite likely to tell you you're deficient when you're not. I mean, seriously likely. It's very unreliable. On the other hand, there's something called liquid chromatography-based tandem mass spectrometry. It's really a hell of a mouthful, but you guys have heard of it a lot from Derek and other people that are very into testing for hormones. This is a much more reliable way to test for vitamin D levels. Historically, this was only available to academics and researchers. In commercial areas and in the clinic, it wasn't used as much. But now it is available, and I will give you references on how to get your own tested in a future video. But here, all I wanted to establish is that this method is far more reliable. Always ask how your vitamin D level is being tested. And if you're reading a paper, always check how they're assaying it. Is it an immunoassay or is it the more reliable version? And before we leave this subject of measurement, I want to also mention that the LCMS assay can also be inaccurate. In particular, there's a version of the 25-OH-D metabolite called the 3-epi version. That can sometimes confuse even the liquid chromatography-based mass spectrometry. So from now on, whenever we mention vitamin D levels in the blood or people's vitamin D levels, unless I say otherwise, we're talking about this liver metabolite, 25-OH-D3. This liver metabolite is measured in nanograms per deciliter in our discussions. I'm always going to use nanograms per deciliter. If you want it per liter, you can multiply it by 2.5 to get the nanomole per liter, which is used in some studies. However, we're going to be using nanograms per deciliter. Now, according to nanograms per deciliter, when is a deficiency state happening? When somebody says you're deficient in vitamin D, what do they really mean? Well, there's a couple of definitions of deficient. Usually there's levels of deficiency. So there's an extreme level of deficiency, then there's sometimes what they call insufficiency. Then some other papers will call the severe deficiency, and they'll call the other one deficiency. This is a little bit extreme, so I like to say deficiency and insufficiency. Deficiency, you'll be surprised to know, is essentially decided according to the levels at which we've seen people develop what's called osteomalacia or rickets, problems with their skeletal structure. So what we have seen is that in people of European descent, if you have a level around 12 or 10 nanograms per deciliter, you may be at risk for developing rickets in a serious fashion. So that's the deficiency state, and that's essentially how academics have set the standard. They almost always will use 10 to 12 nanograms per deciliter as the more extreme version of deficiency. That's what a true deficiency is. Let me point out though, for those of you that are listening and are not actually of European descent, you may tolerate 8 or 10 nanograms per deciliter or 7 and never have skeletal issues. On the other hand, insufficiency is essentially decided at some relatively arbitrary number above that 12 or 10 nanograms per deciliter. Oftentimes, it's a number around 20 or 25 or 30 nanograms per deciliter. This is a number that's thought to indicate some better form of health than you would have had if you were just above deficiency levels in regard to, for example, cancer incidence or immune function or something like that. This is really hazy. It's not very clear why they decide on certain numbers, but what we're going to do here is use a number I've just decided to always use when I call something insufficient, which is 20 nanograms per deciliter. In fact, the US Academy of Medicine does recommend that people keep their levels at 20 nanograms per deciliter, although the US Endocrine Society recommends that they be 30 nanograms per deciliter. And this is generally the case. You'll see some fluctuation there. In our discussion, if I ever mention severely deficient people, that's below 12 nanograms per deciliter. And if I say somebody is insufficient, what I mean to say is they're below 20 nanograms per deciliter. Now that we've established what we're measuring, that liver metabolite of vitamin D that has a 2-week half-life, let's find out what the levels are like among people that have European descent around the world, beginning with North America. Generally speaking, in North America, in the USA, people have better vitamin D status than in Canada. Canada has much worse vitamin D status than the US, but not as bad as Europe's average. The reason vitamin D status is so much better in the USA is because about 40% of Americans supplement with some form of vitamin D. Only about 23% of Americans are insufficient, and a much lower number of European Americans, something around 14%, are insufficient. Remarkably, in the American population, about 5% are severely deficient, having a vitamin D status below 12 nanograms per deciliter, only 5%, while over 3% have hypervitaminosis D, meaning they're in excess. So the almost equal amount have an excess. And in fact, if you look at European Americans, I bet you'd find that an almost exactly equal amount have an excess as have a true deficiency. So what we can make of this is essentially that European Americans are honestly not at great risk for vitamin D deficiency, true deficiency. Maybe there are some people who could have had better health if they had slightly higher vitamin D levels, but this is also debatable. We'll get into more of this subject in future videos. Now, when we were talking about North Americans, we established that about 23% of the entire US population is insufficient in vitamin D status, while only about 14% of the European American population in the US is insufficient in vitamin D status. On the other hand, Canada has a much higher level in general. Across the full Canadian population, over 35% are insufficient in vitamin D status. And Europeans have even worse status. About 40% of Europeans have insufficient vitamin D status, according to them having below 20 nanograms per deciliter. Generally, among the European countries, the Nordic countries have the best vitamin D status. You may be surprised to know. The reason is, actually this is quite insightful. The reason is because they have the best supplementation with vitamin D. In fact, for a period of time, Finland, which neighbored a lot of these other countries that had great status, had horrible vitamin D status compared to them. But Finland's government now instituted some vitamin D fortification of foods, I think it was, that improved the status of the population. Leaving the Nordic countries aside, I should mention, for example, Italy has quite a low insufficiency level. It's about 30s in some areas, but you may be surprised to know that Greece has a very high insufficiency rate. It's over 50%. So is France. So is Britain. And in Britain in the winter, there's an increase of about 14% insufficiency. But these figures don't compare at all to the Turks and the Eastern Europeans. The Bulgarians in wintertime have over 75% insufficiency. I'm not sure if it's 75, but over 70% for sure. On the other hand, the Turks actually have a 75% insufficiency generally. So what you see is that in Eastern Europe, very poor vitamin D status. In parts of Western Europe, in the Nordic countries, you have excellent vitamin D status, better than in the US. And then in Southern Europe and in Western Europe, the vitamin D status is sort of in between, fluctuates between 30% to 55% insufficiencies. These are quite major insufficiencies. Generally speaking, if you're a European watching this, and you're not Nordic and don't supplement with a lot of vitamin D, people you know and yourself may have much worse vitamin D status than Americans, just on average. So that's a brief overview of the vitamin D status of different European populations. Before we leave the subject, I want to mention that among Europeans at the moment, people that have a vitamin D status below 10 nanograms per deciliter, that's the severe deficiency or the real deficiency, they're much more likely to die of COVID. So if you are a European watching this and don't know your levels and don't supplement with vitamin D, you may want to consider doing so now. Next, let's talk about at-risk populations among Europeans. This may apply to other ethnicities as well, but it's less studied there. We'll get into it when we talk about other ethnicities. But here we want to talk about pregnant women, we want to talk about children briefly, slightly about the elderly, and mainly about obese people. We could start with obese people. If you've never heard of this before, this is a very consistent result across the world. Obese people have the lowest vitamin D levels of all. The reason is that vitamin D is used in adipocytes, fat cells, and basically being obese wastes away your vitamin D level. But this is very unfortunate because it creates a positive feedback loop. With a lower vitamin D level, normally vitamin D in obese people, through working on the genes AMP kinase and SIRT1, those are genes involved in our fasting, for example, through working through those genes, usually vitamin D would limit the ability to gain more fat cells. But when you lower your vitamin D levels, you improve your ability to get fatter, and getting fatter reduces your vitamin D levels even further. So obese people are some of the people that most need to supplement with vitamin D. If you're obese and you don't supplement with vitamin D, almost irrespective of where you live in the world or the skin color that you have, you likely need to supplement with vitamin D. Now, pregnant mothers also need to supplement with vitamin D. For example, there are several studies in Canada showing that pregnant mothers have unusual rates of vitamin D insufficiency. Moreover, a pregnant mother's vitamin D insufficiency can cause their children later in life to have a weakened skeletal structure. It seems to have transferative effects onto the next generation. But low vitamin D status can also seriously predispose pregnant mothers to preeclampsia. That's an official state of hypertension in pregnancy that rapidly damages the fetus and causes permanent changes in the health of the baby later in life. Among Canadian pregnant women, those that supplement with vitamin D still had about a 24-25% insufficiency. Those that didn't supplement with vitamin D had over a 45% insufficiency. When women get pregnant, it seems that their vitamin D binding proteins increase, reducing the amount of vitamin D that's available for them. But across the pregnancy, their vitamin D levels improve later on. It's the initial parts of the pregnancy that are the most important to supplement with vitamin D in. Next, let's talk about children. In some populations, you'll find, for example, in New Zealand, which is of European descent mostly, about 80% of newborns in New Zealand have some level of vitamin D insufficiency. Now, by the way, we're going to talk about supplementing newborns or toddlers, or infants, with vitamin D in a future video. I want to warn you now, in case you have a toddler or infant that you want to supplement with vitamin D, and you hear this and get excited and go try to give them some vitamin D, be careful. They are much more likely to develop hypercalcemia than adults, and you basically don't know how they will respond to the vitamin D. They might get very high levels or very low levels. The only way to know, honestly, is to get a blood test. There's so much variance in infants in the way they metabolize vitamin D, much more so than in adults, so be careful. But the point here is that infants sometimes have unusually low vitamin D sufficiency, and also among children, adolescents actually have the lowest levels after infants in some studies. The elderly also in certain populations have higher or lower vitamin D levels than normal adults, but this really differs across countries. And that's also true about gender, by the way. Both gender and whether the elderly have much worse vitamin D levels really differs between countries, even among Europeans. Anyway, friends, thank you so much for bearing with me. I hope this was a little bit informative, probably a little surprising. I think some of you guys wouldn't have expected that the Nordic countries have such good vitamin D status, or that Turks or Greeks could have bad vitamin D status. These are the only really surprising things from this video, to be honest. It was a little bit dry, but we had to get through this so that we have reference points. We know what's going on. We know what we're talking about, the liver metabolite. In fact, let's review what we learned here. So first of all, we learned that there's many different vitamin D metabolites. They have different affinities for the vitamin D receptor, and they're bound to binding proteins, including the vitamin D protein and albumin. Next, we learned that the liver metabolite, which has a half-life of 2 weeks, is the industry standard and what we're talking about when we're talking about vitamin D levels. The liver metabolite can be measured with an immunoassay, which is very ineffective, very inaccurate, or it can be measured with liquid chromatography-based mass spectrometry, and that is much more accurate, although still a little bit inaccurate. The ranges that we're looking for here is that we know among people with European descent, it is known and quite likely that you will develop skeletal damage if your vitamin D level is below, say, 12 nanograms per deciliter or 10 nanograms per deciliter for an extended time period. On the other hand, it's been shown in regard to cancer and immune function and other aspects of our health that having a vitamin D level of that liver metabolite of around 20 nanograms per deciliter to 30 nanograms per deciliter is a conservative estimate of what may be healthful. In fact, in a future video, maybe in the next video, I'm going to tell you what I believe are the most helpful levels for Europeans and what I believe they were naturally, historically, and why they may have been at that level. But we'll talk about that in a future video. Next, we talked about in this video how there are differing vitamin D levels across Europe, how the Nordic countries have the best vitamin D levels, then the Southern European countries with the Western European countries, and then finally the Eastern European countries having the worst vitamin D levels. And we finally talked about the at-risk groups, which are the obese, the pregnant, children, particularly infants and adolescents, potentially the elderly as well. Anyway, friends, I hope you enjoyed this. I'll speak to you again this afternoon. I thank you so much for bearing with me and not turning the video off. I know it was a bit dry. Thank you again. See you soon.